May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O God, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Lori, I want to thank you for your courage to read the end of that psalm. That psalm gets extremely vicious, especially for someone who teaches preschool. So I want to thank you for meeting that challenge with courage. This psalm of lament, this psalm of deep grief and deep anger, it is our task today to pay attention to it. If progressive Christianity has a fault, it is that we look away from the things that make us uncomfortable. We leave out the verses that are too much, too angry, too violent, too filled with grief. Our task today, our task as we have been bearing witness to the words of James Cone this Lenten season, is to pay attention, to be with deep anger, deep grief, deep trauma. This chapter is filled with art. It is filled with specifically poetry and songs. Poetry and songs that were written out of a time of devastation, as was this psalm. So the context of the psalm you can pick up from the beginning of it. The Israelites have been ransacked, they have been captured, and they've been taken into captivity and slavery in a foreign land, and their captors are jeering at them saying, "Sing us your holy songs. Laugh for us." And the last part is a cry for a type of justice. A type of justice based on retribution, one that does continue a cycle of violence, but one that, if you pay attention to the psalm as a whole, starts to make some kind of sense. Or if it doesn't, that may be a mark of our own privilege, that we have never been so devastated that we dream about revenge. In chapter 4 of The Cross and the Lynching Tree, this whole book, which is dedicated to drawing the comparison between the crucifixion and state murder of Jesus, who we call the Christ, and the everyday lynchings that happened and in some ways are still happening in our country today. This has been our task throughout these last 4 weeks. And we will see it through Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, and then turn towards hope and healing on Easter morning, but we aren't there yet. Our task is still to pay attention, to be with, to not look away. That takes spiritual fortitude. I know for myself, I would much rather just ignore the heinous violence going on in our world. But again, that is my privilege. I can turn off the TV, get off of Twitter, not watch the videos. I can choose to do that because it is not my everyday life. There are tropes. In fact, we have been discussing them as a country over the last week. There are tropes of angry Black people. But if you understand the type of violence that they are facing every day, wouldn't you also be angry? It is not ours to police the tone with which their rage is taking form. It is for us to bear witness to their anger and seek to understand why. To take that deeply into our bones, to understand it on a soul level. In fact, America has done the same thing that the Babylonians did to the the Jewish people in this psalm. We have wanted Black people to sing for us. We have wanted Black people to dance for us. We have wanted them to entertain us, to turn their pain into something beautiful, and that is something that we expect. Can we see where this art is coming from? Can we sit with it and understand its pain, not just on an intellectual level, but can we feel it? That is our task, one that we have committed to together as a community. In chapter 4, there are excerpts of several poems, some of which are readily available. Some have almost been lost to time that even a tech native with pretty decent Google skills can't dig up. Maybe there's a reason for that. These poems being buried because they are too painful for us to look at, and yet that is our task. I've chosen one of the poems to read in its entirety for us to practice being with today. I'm going to read it. Then I'm going to read the psalm again after a few moments of silence. I think that in conversation, they illuminate each other so that we can begin our work of understanding on a soul level, so that we can actually live in solidarity, not making Black people pretty up their pain for us so that it is manageable, but to tap into our own deep grief and maybe our own deep guilt because of what we have been complicit in or what we have borne witness to and not stopped. This is our work. This is our task. It requires slowness. It requires space. That's what we're going to do together today. This is The Lynching by Claude McKay. His spirit in smoke ascended to high heaven. His father, by the cruelest way of pain, had bidden him to his bosom once again. The awful sin remained still unforgiven. All night, a bright and solitary star, perchance the one that ever guided him, yet gave him up at last to faded wild wind, hung pitifully o'er the swinging char. Day dawned, and soon the mixed crowds came to view the ghastly body swaying in the sun. The women thronged to look, but never a one showed sorrow in her eyes of steely blue. And little lads, lynchers that were to be, danced round the dreadful thing in fiendish glee. I'm going to invite us into a time of silence so that we can sit with those words and images, the grief and the pain that is present in them. There will be a gong, and then when the time of silence is over, there will be 3. In context of this poem, hear now again the words of Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down, down to its foundations, O daughter Babylon, you devastator. Happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against rock. Take some silence to sit with the words of the psalm as well. I have no doubt that that was a difficult exercise for us. So I want to take a moment to be in community around that difficulty. When you sat with those poems, those songs of deep pain, grief, and lament, what were some of the words or thoughts or images that came to mind?
Main thing from my sheltered point of view, I never heard much about lynching, but it's us good people just do Sunday activity, which readers are expected. I'm still in a process of it. I know what happened, but it's like in interior, it's like, really, that really happened? So that's, I think that really good.
Yeah, the outrage makes sense when you look at it, when you confront the reality of that history. Other thoughts?
The simple visualization of children running around circles under a charred body hanging from a tree.
There are actual lynching photos that show that exact thing happening. It isn't just a fanciful poetic device, it is history. An ugly thing for us to sit with, but one that's deeply important for us to do that with. Other thoughts? Karima.
In a way, I can almost feel or understand the European people who separate themselves from this, because right away I jumped into, well, I didn't grow up in this country, so I didn't do this, you know.
Mhm.
And you know, I for the little that I knew, I thought it had happened a long time ago, that it had not continued in how police treat people. But I can definitely understand how some folks separate themselves, you know. I didn't do this to anybody.
Yeah, there's deep comfort in that. I didn't do it. It wasn't me or my family. And yet that is the thing that bars us from being in relationship to people suffering. When we can say, not me, then we don't have to look at it this closely, this intimately, or understand where that anger comes from, because we can separate ourselves from it. But the ask of this Lenten season is that we try really hard not to do that exact thing. Rosemary.
I just want to say my outrage of this just turns into feelings of helplessness and sadness. And I'm just so grateful that we're recognizing and remembering this to help the future so it doesn't happen, keep happening. So that's why I'm very grateful for that we're doing what we're doing.
Thank you, Rosemary. You named what I hope is what happens. Often anger or dissociation, separating ourselves from, is how we stay out of relationship with suffering. You know, so if I want to fight something or someone, or if there's, you know, when something bad is happening, if there's something I can do, we have this startup energy to go fix it. But that is what the litany of intention asks us not to do, right? We can't leap to fixing something that is this broken. But if you sit and let the rage move, you find out its actual name is grief. And it is hard for us to deeply grieve this. But if we are going to be in relationship and solidarity, that is exactly what we have to do. Deborah, and then Nancy, I see you.
Well, yeah, thinking about the Ukraine and how they're being forced away from everything they know, and put this poem in a reality for me that's really hard. So people were taken away from everything they knew, you know, their culture, their food, their ancestors, everything they knew, ripped up and then thrown in this new place. And of course, it's Babylon, and it's also the United States for people ripped out of Africa. And then everything in the US was against them. The courts weren't there for them. The security of a police person wasn't there for them. Up until, well, it's still going on, but I'm thinking of Jim Crow. And then how we hold Black people responsible for their situation, as if losing everything, your culture, your ancestors, your homeland, can be rebuilt in less than 200 years in a system that still is against them. And it just, I wish we could get people to understand that. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. The psalm and the discussion of Babylon, that is the transatlantic slave trade. Nancy.
The image of the pregnant woman being lynched and her baby ripped from her is too painful for me to bear.
Yeah, in the chapter, there is another poem. I think it's called a Christendom Festival, if I'm correct. But it has an extremely graphic image of a man who was lynched, his wife, who was also burned, and it's an image of both murders, and she was pregnant. That poem is extremely powerful, but it is the one that I had to search like the underbelly of the internet to find. Published in 1920. It is one of those things that we have not reproduced in, the same way that we have reproduced other art from that time. So it is not easily accessible. And I think that there is a reason for that, because it is too ugly to look at for most white folks. But again, our task is to look at the ugly thing, to be with it. Yeah, that is an incredibly powerful moment in the book. And if you read the whole chapter, moment in the chapter as well. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, Cayenne.
So I was thinking about how Tuesday this week, March 29th, President Biden signed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. And after more than 200 attempts in the last century to get this law into place, and that number, 200 attempts, it has failed. And even in the passing of it, there was on Fox News, there were several hosts that complain about this, about Biden signing this act, in various ways. You know, some of the complaints were that, you know, he's got his attention on something that's not important, because this is not something that people are experiencing today. Even though there are at least 8 definitely recorded lynchings that have happened since 2000, and that's 22 years, but that's 8 too many. And you know, and then there are other lynchings, you know, as we talk about the cross and look at Jesus, that occur, that don't have the image, the act of a noose, and yet they're still lynchings. So and I get to notice, and part of this, what I feel is just the whole idea of a lynching, past, present, or future, and the impact that it has on Black people who remain, not just families, but those of us, in terms of being able to freely exercise our constitutional rights and be supported in doing that, how they are diminished consistently each time something like this occurs. So it's really hard to hold the excitement of this act being passed when at the same time you have, I mean, the pushback is so fast that says that this is a waste of time. So we have to push forward. We have to push really hard, first of all in ourselves before we go out into the world and hold accountability, because there's a constant, something happens that looks and feels like acknowledgement of the truth, and acknowledgement of our humanity, and then the pushback that happens so fast is, it's not devastating, but it reeks of devastation.
Thank you, Kaya. "200 times. Let's take a moment to breathe with that it has taken us 200 attempts, or even the remotest bit of acknowledgement of this kind of violence that has been rampant in our country. This isn't just a Deep South issue. There have been lynchings in Colorado. There have been lynchings in the Midwest and in the North. There is no place that isn't touched by this kind of violence. This isn't a sermon that's going to end with a nice bow. I'm not going to bring it home. You just get to sit with it. No ifs, no ands, no buts. Just this. Amanda.
For me, the closing of the sermon is a growing sense of horror and screams of no.
Thank you. Yeah. I think that when we can lay aside the defense mechanisms that we have in place to not see this, in all of what it is. That is the faithful response. Yeah.
Okay, all right, I'm gonna try to stay calm because I got a lot of emotions. But I think as a nation, I think a big part of what we do is we like to look how far we've come. But we don't look at how far we need to go. And so we can say like, oh, well, it's not the same way it was. It's not. But they've just changed the way they do things. We've changed the way that we look at things, but that doesn't mean it hasn't stopped happening. With our police constantly killing people of color. And it's appalling, and it just gets buried. It gets buried in the news. It gets buried. How many hate crimes consistently happen? And we just ignore it. And it's just like, there's just so much going on. There's so much that we need to move forward in. But we're so focused on, well, it's not that. It's not what it used to be. But it's not good either.
Thank you. Thank you all for your courage, your bravery, and whatever it is that you're tapping into that is allowing you to sit and be with this. I couldn't have done this sermon just anywhere. And I am so proud to be in the ashes with you. Thank you for not looking away. Thank you for your grief, for your anger, for your attention. Amen.